Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm your host, Scotty West. This is Lesson 8, so make sure your booklet is open to page 8. Today, we're going to finish up our discussion on the musical number system and the major scale. Then we're going on to a fascinating topic. Where did this 12-note pitch system evolve from anyway, and what does this say about modern music? Remember, keep reviewing your past material. Ready? And away we go. Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to finish up our discussion on what we were talking about last week, which is this musical number system thing, which is so important. You've all heard of like C7 chords, and you've heard people talking about 1, 4, 5 progressions and stuff like that, but not very many people ever actually get to the point where they really understand what this is about. Remember, the musical number system is an alternative way of assigning names to the 12 notes in our pitch system that treats music as if there's only one key to play in. And what that means is it makes learning your pitch patterns like 11 times easier, because instead of having to remember 12 different sets of alphabet letters, at least in the beginning, you just have to remember one set of numbers. But how does this musical number system actually work? Remember, it numbers all of the 13 notes in an octave, but not each one of the 13 notes actually has a whole number associated with it. Look at this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then we have these sharp and flat numbers in between. Which notes get the actual whole numbers associated with them are the ones that are in this very important and famous pitch pattern that we all know. It's that do, re, mi thing. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And doing that is the same as going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in order to understand that, remember, we had to look at these two words. It's all about intervals. Intervals is a huge word in music. In many ways, it isn't so much what notes you play, oddly enough, in music. It really has a lot more to do with how far apart the notes are from one another. And that's what intervals are. It's the pitch distance between two notes. The only two intervals we have to know about for right now are whole steps and half steps, you might remember. A half step, all of the notes in a chromatic scale are separated by half steps. When you play a note and then you skip a note, that's what's known as a whole step. Our other word that we need to make sure we remember what that's about is, what is a scale? Everybody thinks they know what scales are. A scale is, for example, a sequence of notes. But actually, it's the spacing of the notes that really constitutes scale patterns more than actually what notes you actually play. And oops, how do you like that? Lost my stopwatch. The sequence of a scale is a sequence of notes that are separated by very specific intervals, mostly whole steps and half steps in scales. The major diatonic scale, which is the one that the number system is based on, goes whole step from 1 to 2, or from do to re, and then another whole step to note number 3, or mi. But then remember, 3 and 4 are right next to each other. They're consecutive notes. They're going to be consecutive half steps on, or consecutive frets on your fretboard of your guitar. Then it's a whole step to 5, a whole step to 6, a whole step to 7, and then a half step to 8. And if you look down here, that's how the number system actually works. Here's our 13 notes, but notice 3 and 4 and 7 and 8 are next to each other. And then all the other ones have a note in between them, and these are sharp and flat numbered notes. For example, the note that's a half step above note number 1 is a sharp 1 or a flat 2. We do the same thing to the in-between numbers that we do to the in-between letters. We sharp and flat them. Now, now kind of where we left off last week is all about this. You are going to see numbers like 9 and 10 and 11 and 13. If the number system is based on the major scale, which only has 8 notes per octave, where do we find notes like note number 9 and note number 10 and note number 13? Well, the best way to think about it for now, you'll find out this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but the best way to think of it for now is some of the pitch patterns that you play, the notes are spaced too far apart from one another to actually all fit inside of one octave. So lots of times we begin to spill over into a second octave. 8, after all, remember, is the same as 1. That's just the octave note of note number 1 down here. So 9, in the end, is just the same as 2. And, of course, it's a whole step above 8 because 1 and 2 are a whole step apart. 10 and 11 are only a half step apart. And the reason for that is, of course, because they're the same as 3 and 4. It's just that they're up in the next octave. About the highest number you're ever going to see routinely is a 13. There is a chord called a 13 chord. 13 is the same as 6. It's just up in the next octave, or at least that's the way we're looking at for now. That's how the musical number system works. So important because in the end, it'll just make it a lot easier for you to really understand how these pitch patterns work. And remember, the most significant thing to remember about the number system is it treats music like there's only one key to play in instead of 12. So it just makes it 11 times easier to learn your pitch patterns. Now, the major scale is a pitch pattern, isn't it? So, like any other pitch pattern, we eventually have 4 different ways. If you remember this from lesson 2, we have 4 different ways that we need to know each pitch pattern. Remember that stuff? First way is you have to be able to think the patterns. You have to have them in your head. So you have to know your music theory. And you do. At this point now, you understand the theory of a major scale. Like any other scale, it's a pattern of intervals. It's mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. You also have to know how to recognize this stuff when you see it on paper. That's the second way you need to know your pitch patterns. You need to know, at least on some level, how to read music. And as a matter of fact, our next lesson is going to be all about written music. We're going to talk a little bit about reading music, and we'll look at that stuff more. Most importantly, third way to know your pitch patterns is you have to know what they sound like. You know what a do-re-mi scale sounds like. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And finally, the fourth way is you have to know how to play it on your instrument. You have to know the finger pattern for a major scale. And that's what we're going to look at right now. We're going to fish this thing up here. Here's our famous fretboard chart again. And now, remember, it really requires what we might call the box is 6 frets on a guitar neck. Can we zoom in on this? There we go. 6 frets on a guitar neck. Remember, everybody else thinks that the box is just 4 frets, but remember, you need to play 5 notes on each string in order to really control a chromatic scale on the guitar. And the 6th fret is here because, remember, to play that 5th note, you can either use your index finger to reach up here and get notes on that fret, or you can use your pinky to get down and get notes on that fret down there. Now, when we're playing a major scale, remember there are 12 different keys that you can play a major scale in. So essentially, do, or your root note, or note number 1, could be any one of these notes on any one of these strings right here. So what that means is ultimately when we're heavily into scales in a few weeks, you're going to discover that there are actually several different fingerings for every scale. There's really dozens of fingerings for any individual scale. Some are more difficult fingerings than others, being more difficult by the fact that they have more finger shifts in them. But there are some ways to play a major scale that either have no finger shifts in them at all, that is, you can play them within just 4 frets, or they only have 1 finger shift. I'm going to just show you 3 different fingerings right now for a major scale. And what you're going to see is that if you understand your fretboard, the finger positions that we put here are directly going to reflect what you understand about the actual interval pattern for a major scale. The first way that everybody basically learns the major scale, the easiest way, which has no finger shifts in it, works like this. We're going to put do under our second finger on our low E string. See, now if you were playing here, your index finger would be controlling this fret, so this is actually going to be your second finger on this fret right here, and this is do, or in other words, it's note number 1. Now, we know from what we understand about the pattern of intervals for a major scale that note number 2, or re, is a whole step above note number 1. So what that must mean is if this is note number 1 right here, then a whole step to 2 would bring you to right there, wouldn't it? Do, re. And that note would be, of course, played with your pinky. Now, we also know it's a whole step from 2 to 3. If you recall, a half step above this would either be here or it would be an index finger reach out here. We don't want a half step here. We actually want a whole step above note number 2, so that would be right here, wouldn't it? So this is actually number 3 right here. So we've gone 1 whole step to 2, whole step to 3. Now, remember, in a major scale, the 4th note is only a half step above the 3rd note, so that must mean that note number 4 is right here. See, no mystery to how any of this stuff works at all if you understand your fretboard. Whole step to 5, if you recall. Then a whole step to 6 would bring us back to here again. And then a whole step to 7 would bring us to here. And then remember, 7 and 8 are only a half step apart. So right here under your pinky would be note number 8, or your octave note right there. So this goes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And remember, to use this box, do is actually going to be under your second finger right there. It's not going to be under your index finger. It's going to be under your second finger right there. Now, that's just 1 octave. Remember, we have about 2 1/3 octaves worth of notes that we can play in any given area of the fretboard, so we can play another full octave. This is note number 8 here, but of course it would also be note number 1 for the second octave. So we need to go a whole step to note number 2. Now, you could call this note number 9 too, remember, but you don't always have to use those extended numbers. For right now, we're just going to call that note number 2 again, and it's a whole step above 8 or 1. Then we need a whole step to 3 and a half step to 4. They're right next to each other. There's 3 and 4 right there. Now, a whole step to 5 would normally take us to this fret right here, wouldn't it? The only thing is, these are those 2 strings that are tuned 1 note closer together. Remember that when we were talking about how your guitar is actually tuned? These 2 strings are only tuned 3 notes apart instead of 4. So what that means is anything that shows up on the B string here has to be raised by 1 fret in order to compensate for that tuning difference. So 5 would normally be right here, but on this string, 5 actually winds up here. Whole step to 6, whole step to 7 would bring us back to our index finger on our high E string, and then a half step to 8. And there it is, 2 octaves of a major diatonic scale. Remember, on the same fret on your 2 outside strings, that's always 2 octaves apart, isn't it? Again, if you've forgotten about that, go back and review your lesson on how the fretboard actually works. This, of course, is that middle octave in between the 2 right there. So, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 2 octaves actually of a major scale right there. That is 1 fingering for a major scale. There are slews of other fingerings for the major scale. There is only 1 other one that requires no finger shifts. Notice that coincidentally, if you will, just because of the way the interval pattern falls, we did not have to include any notes by doing either index shifts or pinky shifts. We were lucky there. We just managed to get away with it because we started on our second finger. There is only one other way to play a major scale that has no finger shifts in it, and that is if do is under your pinky on your A string. Remember, do can be anywhere. So if this is note number 1 now, remember our pattern of intervals, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. There's note number 1. We need a whole step to 2, which would bring us to here, a whole step to 3, a half step to 4, a whole step to 5, a whole step to 6. Now, interestingly enough, if we put the numbers here, 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember, it's a whole step from 6 to 7. So you might think that that would bring you out of the box onto this shaded fret either here or there. But remember, these are the two strings that are tuned only 3 notes apart, so we luck out here. You could play that 7 right here if you wanted to, but right there. But you'll probably find instead of being here on your B string, it would be raised up 1 fret. So again, we don't really have to do any finger shifts here. That would be note number 7. Then remember, it's only a half step from 7 to 8. So your octave note would be right there. Now, we notice how we've started further along than where we started before. We're actually at the top of our A string right here. So what this means is even though it's still 2 1/3 octaves from your lowest note to your highest note here, we can't play 2 full octaves in any given direction. We can still play a total of 2 octaves. But here you'll see, again, if this is note number 1 for the next octave, then it's a whole step to 2, and a whole step to 3, and a half step to 4, and a whole step to 5. So we can only get up to note number 5 in this second octave, playing in this position like that. But by the same token, we can go down from this note into a previous octave. We could think of this as being note number 8 for the previous octave. So it's a half step down to 7, and then a whole step down to 6, and then a whole step down to 5, whole step down to 4, and then finally, remember, 3 and 4 are only a half step apart. So once again, you can see that we have no finger shifts involved with this way of playing a major scale. But those are the only 2 within the box that you can actually play with no finger shifts. Now, to show you what I mean, I'm going to show you one last fingering for a major scale now, where you'll see that you have to play a finger shift just because of the way that the intervals fall. What if do is under your pinky on your E string? What if that's note number 1? Well, then we need a whole step to 2, a whole step to 3, a half step to 4, a whole step to 5, a whole step to 6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now here's where the problem occurs. If this is note number 6 right here, we need a whole step to note number 7. And there's no way around it this time. So that means that note number 7 is going to be here. It's going to be, in this case, that would be a pinky reach when we're coming down the scale. Of course, that's the same note, if you remember how your fretboard works, that's the same note as this note right here. So you have an option of 2 different places where you can play note number 7. Then, of course, it's a half step to 8, so you'll be back here. And this would actually be a bona fide index finger shift to get from the 7 to the 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Probably coming down the scale, you'd go 8, reach out with your pinky, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, again, you can go another octave above this. If this is note number 1 for the next octave, then 2 would be here. Now, you might think a whole step to 3 would take you to either there or there, but this time we do luck out. 3 on this string gets raised by a half step, so 3 would actually be there. Half step to 4, if you recall. Whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. And there's your second octave of your major diatonic scale. Over here, you could also go down a little bit, too, into a previous octave. You could go 8, and then a half step down to 7, and then a whole step down to 6, like that as well. Now, you'll notice you have all of these fingerings for the major scale in your chart booklet of different scale fingerings, along, as you'll notice, with all the other ones, too. many fingerings for a major scale essentially include playing a finger shift on almost every string. Eventually, you might like to learn all those too, but a good place to start is with these easiest ones. The two that we just mentioned a moment ago where there were no finger shifts involved in it at all, and then this one which just has this one finger shift, which of course you could either play with your index finger or your pinky, depending on what's the best thing to do. Okay? There you go. Now, that's it. Boy, did you learn a lot of stuff in that lesson. Some people go their entire lives, guitar playing lives, and never know any of this stuff at all, and that's another one of those reasons why most people kind of get like into their mid-20s and they're just really not playing anymore. To satisfy yourself, you've got to know what you're doing, and take it from me. A lot of people are going to try to tell you differently, but that's it. And one of the keys to really understanding what's going on in music is understanding about how this musical number system works. And there it is right there, based on the major scale. All the other numbers are sharp and flat. And you just have to remember the pattern of intervals, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Cool, pretty good, huh? This also, remember, allows you to basically understand how the musical slide rule works, too. For example, if we can take a look at this for a second. Probably have to zoom in real tight on this one. This upper row right here of the musical slide rule. Let's see if we can get in real close on this upper left-hand corner here of this. Right. This first interval pattern that you have up here is the major scale. It's also known as the Ionian mode. Notice how it's a whole step from the first note to the second note, a whole step to the third note, but then 3 and 4 are right next to each other, whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. And you'll also see right underneath each one of those boxes, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll see the actual number of the musical number system right there. So this is one of the most important areas on your slide rule. The major scale, arguably, is the central pitch pattern in all of Western music. And it's right there in the upper left-hand corner of your slide rule. So that's kind of the key to understanding how the whole slide rule works, too. Okay, that's it for that subject for now. We're going to go on to this really interesting thing now. This is one of my favorite things to show people because a lot of people have lived and died and had careers in music and didn't know what I'm about to tell you right now, but I could not have been one of them. Remember, I was the kid who always had to know why, you know what I mean? And this is a question that started to evolve in my mind, I think, when I was in like junior high school or something, and I'd already been playing music for several years. I knew that there were 12 notes. And I was just sort of taking that for granted the way everybody else does. But then I remember I went into science class one day. It was like earth science, and we were talking about the physics of sound. We were talking about acoustics. And my science teacher wound up saying a rather interesting thing. He says, pitch is a continuum. Now, do you know what a continuum is? Well, a continuum is something that continues, isn't it? It goes on and on and on and on and on. When you're talking about continuums, you're talking about shades of infinity. Oops, I should have brought my slide rule. Two qualities that a continuum has. First of all, it goes on forever. And the other thing is, it proceeds on forever in a smooth and seamless flow. Now, let's for a moment take time. We humans are not exactly sure whether time is a continuum or not, but let's say for now that it is. First of all, let's assume that time is going to go on forever. So it's a continuum. The other thing is, there really are no real increments or signposts along the way. Cosmically, there really isn't any such thing as a second or a minute or an hour. We humans just created these machines that like click at a particular rate so we could sort of keep track of this time thing as it goes by, but it's not like you experience each second as it goes by. There are, in other words, an infinite number of moments in time, all infinitely close together. Time is a continuum, let's say for now anyway. Now, pitch is a continuum as well. There are an infinite number of musical pitches, all infinitely close together. They start way up here where you can't even hear them, and they come sliding down. We know pitch is all about high and low. They come sliding down in a smooth and seamless flow. I usually have my slide whistle with me, and I go, till eventually they get down so low that you can't hear them anymore. There are an infinite number of musical pitches. So I'm sitting there in class going, well, this is all very interesting. If there's an infinite number of musical pitches, how come all the music I ever heard has 12 lousy notes in it? And I'm starting to wonder, where did this whole 12-note system come from? Kind of an interesting question, huh? Most people are taking music totally for granted well before they get to this question. But now, and some people go, why is he talking to us about this stuff? Isn't this some esoteric question about music history? Or isn't this something almost about anthropology, archaeology? Because what you're going to find out in a minute, as I call this my caveman music theory lesson, because we're going to go back to cavemen and or cave persons, and they actually started to figure it out tens of thousands of years ago, no doubt, and we're going to kind of show you how that works. Now, people go, why is he talking to me about this stuff? I just want to play rock and roll in 1999. Well, the interesting thing is, you are going to find out that the very first pitch patterns that humans ever discovered are still the ones that are driving the whole boat today. Nothing has really changed since the dawn of time. The first pitch patterns we ever discovered are the central ones that hold all the music that we play together too. And so it's kind of an interesting little detective story about how how people figured out this 12-note system. We didn't really invent it. It's more like we kind of just discovered it. It took us a few thousand years to figure it out, but we finally did. So here's our question. Pitch is a continuum. How come we decided, which we did, how come we decided to chop it up, as it were, into 12-note octaves? Interesting question, huh? Well, the first word I write down for people around here is the word science. Wonderful, spiritual, expressive, emotional thing that music is. It's also a pretty knowable phenomenon. There's really not any mystery to how it works. And I don't mean science on the level of like calculators and microscopes and stuff like that. We're talking caveman science here. So in a sense, what we're really talking about, we might simply call the predictable result. Humans like to have systems in place where there's a predictable outcome to a particular set of events. For example, our system of math, it's pretty predictable, isn't it? I mean, every time you add 1 and 1, you get 2. And that makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we understand the world. If one day we added 1 and 1 and got 3, we would probably trash our entire system of math and start over again. You know what I mean? So humans are always kind of looking for predictable systems in the world around them, and the development of music is no exception. And so I tell this little story. I made this up. It didn't really happen this way, but maybe it did. It could have. We don't know, because this is all prehistory. This is before people even started writing stuff down. But our story begins at the dawn of time, and I figure people were pretty much the same way then that they are now, which is, first of all, they demand predictability from the systems they employ, and they like to party on Saturday night. So our story begins, and it's like Saturday night, and everybody's, tens of thousands of years ago, and everyone's sitting around the campfire. Now, we know that they're already visual artists. They're making little carvings and paintings in the caves and all, so we got to figure they're working on some kind of audio art form, too. They have no instruments yet, except that one, so they're sitting around the campfire on Saturday night, and they're trying to sing. But what they are doing is they're singing the type of music that one would sing if one was what I call awash in the chaos of infinity. If there's an infinite, if pitch is a continuum, there are an infinite number of different possibilities, and that is just too much for humans to deal with on any level at all. It just boggles our minds too much. But I imagine that they were doing it anyway. They were trying to sing with an infinite number of variables, and I imagine it sounded something like this. They're just making a lot of weird noise because, in a sense, if anything goes, then like anything goes. You know what I mean? Now there are a couple of reasons why that style of music didn't continue, at least in the mainstream, till today. A couple of reasons. One is, probably every now and then they would get little glimpses of some kind of system that was more ordered and sublime than that, but it would just be too fleeting. It would come at them and they wouldn't be able to wrap their minds around it and figure out what was actually going on. But the worst problem, the second problem with music like that is nobody could remember from 1 minute to the next how any of the songs went. You know that Caveman song I sang about 40 seconds ago? Could I repeat that, like note for note? I don't think so. I might be able to do. I don't even really remember what I did. You know, too many variables makes it impossible to remember anything. So they would all be singing this great song on Saturday night, and they'd wake up Sunday morning, and everybody would be going, "Now, how did that song go?" They wouldn't be able to remember. So they were on the lookout for some kind of predictable pitch way of controlling pitch that they could actually rely on to deliver them a manageable system of pitches that they could do stuff with. And it all kind of started one day, at least the way in my made-up story here, it all kind of started one day when this particular cave guy or person was out in the woods and they had their bow and arrow with them. This is my bow and arrow right here. And they were just about to fire an arrow at a saber-toothed tiger when a tree limb fell out of the tree over the guy's head and hit him in the head just as he fired the arrow. And here's what happened. He goes, "What did I just do?" And he realizes he's made the first great discovery about pitch. Yes, there's this huge swirling infinity of pitch around us all the time, but if you want to, you can freeze it somewhere, and a convenient place to do that is right on your bow and arrow string. And then you can listen to that sound, and you can have some idea about that sound, and you can make that noise yourself. Wow, this is an incredible discovery. But then he gets nervous. Maybe this is some kind of fluke. You know what I mean? It's like he's got to make sure that this is a predictable result. So he's got his spare bow with him. He decides to try it on that bow. Oh my God, this appears to happen on every single bow you ever pluck the string on. You can make a frozen pitch and you can listen to it and decide what that sounds like. He goes running back to the village. They're all sitting around the campfire for the umpteen millionth year going, "Boo," making all this weird noise. He comes running into town. He goes, "Hey, look, everybody, I think I found the first predictable result in music." And they all go, yeah, right, sure. And he goes, "Yeah, watch this." It's like, oh my God, it freaks them all out. This is the greatest thing they've ever heard in their lives. Somebody goes, "It's an evil bow possessed by some demon, you know?" And he goes, no, this is predictable. I can do this on any bow. Wow, this is the greatest thing in the world. This guy's immediately elevated to chief of the village. He goes out into the woods to the ceremonial tree. He cuts a branch off the ceremonial tree and he strings up the ceremonial bow. This is going to be their ultimate reference point from now on. They're never going to forget how the music goes anymore because, in a way, they've gone too far in the other direction. They went from an infinity of notes that nobody could remember from moment to moment down to one lousy note that nobody could forget. So they keep the bow, the ceremonial bow, in the ceremonial hut on the edge of town. And every Saturday night, this guy gets up in front of the campfire and he goes, "Okay, everybody, sing along this time." And the whole village joins in. It's like a religious experience. They're all singing this one note out in the woods. You know what I mean? And it's really cool. You know, and it's always predictable. If they wake up Sunday morning and they can't remember how the music goes, then they go to the ceremonial hut and they get the ceremonial bow and they go, okay, we remember how the song goes now. Well, this lasted for a few tens of thousands of years, but it's getting kind of boring just singing one note all the time. So, about 1 million years later, there's a second cave person out in the woods, and they also have their bow and arrow with them. And they haven't seen any animals yet, and so they're kind of just sitting there absent-mindedly messing around with their bow and arrow, and absent-mindedly starts putting his fingers on the string of the guitar and resting it lightly. Did I say guitar? I meant bow. Resting their fingers lightly on the string of the bow, and with their other hand, they're kind of absent-mindedly plucking at that string. And you know that if you rest your fingers on a guitar string, it mutes the string off and prevents it from vibrating, so you don't get really much of any kind of pitch information out of it all. You get just like clicks and thumps. No real musical note coming out of there, is there, with my fingers resting lightly on the string. So he's sitting there kind of absent-mindedly clicking and thumping away on his bow, when absent-mindedly he sort of begins to move his fingers around on the bow string while he's clicking and thumping, and he continues to get to producing clicks and thumps until his finger winds up in a particular place on the bow string, and all of a sudden a loud musical note rings out. It kind of goes, where did that come from? I had my fingers on the string, and I was just getting these clicks and thumps, but when I got to a particular place, and if I go beyond that, it's back to like clicks and thumps again. Wow, that's interesting. He goes, I wonder if there's any more of those, and he's moving his fingers around some more. Wow, there's another one right there. Wow, that's kind of interesting. Oh, but then he gets nervous. He goes, oh, maybe this is an evil bow possessed by some demon. Remember, he's got to make sure it's a predictable thing. So he's got his spare bow with him, and he begins to move his fingers around on the strings of that, clicking and thumping, when all of a sudden, right in the same spot, there's one right there at the 5th fret on your guitar. There's another one at the 7th fret. There's one at the 12th fret. Everything else is kind of clicks and thumps. Loud musical notes ringing out. And this, he's discovering that this happens on any bow. You know, if you find the magic spot, it's like the string refuses to be deadened off. Now, do you know what these things are called? I bet you do. A lot of people know about this. If you've played the guitar for any time at all, you know that these things are called harmonics. And so what is this scientific thing that we humans discovered? We discovered that there are these magic spots on a bow and arrow string that produce these notes. So the scientific thing that we discovered is we discovered these things called harmonics. As I mentioned before, a lot of people who've played the guitar for a while have been shown about how to produce harmonics on their guitar, but most guitar players kind of tend to think of harmonics as being some funny little trick that your guitar does, some funny little finger trick. But actually, it's a very profound thing. In the end, it was the discovery of these magic spots along any string that actually led to the creation of our entire 12-note pitch system. And how that actually occurred, I'll show you now. Now that we have discovered these three notes, these three harmonics, and we're going to talk for now. There are more harmonics, by the way, but that's beyond the scope of this program to really talk about. We are going to talk about the three loudest harmonics on the neck of your guitar. The one at the 12th fret, the one at the 7th fret, and the one at the 5th fret. Now that we have discovered these three harmonics, we need to begin to look at what pitch relationships listening to these three harmonics begin to expose to our ears. Or in other words, the question is, now that we've discovered these harmonics, what pitch relationships do they show us? In other words, what three number / notes. Remember, we're going to be looking at all this information within that number system that we just finished learning about. What three number notes can be produced harmonically on any string, whether it's a nice 1999, 2000 Stratocaster or whether it's a bow and arrow, a 10,000-year-old bow and arrow. It's going to work pretty much the same way. There is a harmonic on our guitar neck anyway, what we think is the 12th fret, the 5th fret, and the 7th fret. Now, let's listen to these harmonics. But we'll even forget about the open string for a moment. Let's listen to the 12th fret harmonic. I'm going to do this on my A string of my guitar. What I do is right over the fret. When you're producing harmonics, you put your finger right over the fret, not in between the frets as you do when you normally play. Because what your finger is actually doing is kind of replacing the fret in this context. I put my finger right over my 12th fret and I pluck it, and I get that pitch out of it. Remember, everywhere else is just clicks and thumps, but right there, I get this loud musical note out. Now, what number note is that? Well, remember, any note can be any number. Right now, because we're looking at this on our A string, that A harmonic, that would actually be an A note, an octave higher than your open string. We are going to call that note number 1, because remember, any note can be do, do, do. So we're going to call this harmonic on the 12th fret here note number 1. And that's our ultimate point that we're starting from right there. Oops. Do. Now that we understand about these harmonics, what pitch relationships do these harmonics expose to our ears? Let's skip the 7th fret for a moment and let's go to the 5th fret. That's the harmonic at the 5th fret. Here's the harmonic at the 12th fret again. Does that sound like any pitch pattern that you're familiar with at all? Do you know what the pitch relationship between those two notes are? They're not the same note, are they? This one is higher in pitch than this one is. But how much higher? Even though they're different, they also have a certain similarity about them, don't they? They actually kind of blend into each other. They actually sound similar in a different kind of way, whatever that means. Do you have any idea what that pitch relationship is? Well, if you listen closely, and if you have a little bit of experience and maybe even some trained ears, you would know that that is actually an octave right there. And you know what an octave is. It's after you've gone through all 12 notes and landed on the 13th note where the alphabet starts over again. So, the harmonic at your 5th fret is an octave higher than the harmonic at your 12th fret. Now, within the musical number system, what is the number of the octave note? I'll pause your VCR for a second and think about that, because this would be proving to yourself that you really do know how the musical number system works. What is the number of the octave note? You know it's the 13th note up from note number 1, but we don't call it note number 13. What do we call it? It's note number 8, right? So the harmonic that you produce at the 5th fret is 1 octave above note number 1. So in our musical number system, that would be note number 8. Now, any idiot cave person could figure this stuff out. And so, where, you might ask yourself, you know, we have this thing in music called an octave. Where did it come from? Well, there it is. Any cave person could actually produce the pitch relationship known as an octave just by finding those magic spots on the string in which you put your finger there and you get this really cool sounding pattern. The other thing is it must have sounded really good to them too. It must have been this really pure and interesting kind of sound. And so, for the next million years, they all sat around the campfire singing octaves. So I'm suggesting in my bogus little story here that the first pitch pattern that humans ever discovered, predictable pitch pattern, was the octave. Now, here's the thing. Like I said, why is this guy talking about this? We want to play rock and roll in 1999. This is the first pitch pattern that humans ever discovered. But ask yourself this question. Here it is, the year 2000 now. Is there any pitch relationship in music that is more significant than the concept of the octave? I think not. There may be some other patterns that you could make a case for being as significant as an octave, but there certainly isn't any pitch relationships more significant in music even today than the octave is, and yet it was the very first one that we ever discovered. Now, we have one more harmonic at the 7th fret, too. Let's see if we can figure out what that relationship is. So, once again, here's our harmonic at the 12th fret. Here's our octave harmonic at the 5th fret. Let's listen to these two notes a couple times. Get that sound of that octave in your mind. Now listen to this. Here's the harmonic at the 7th fret. Now here's the octave again. Now here's the 7th fret again. Now, if your ears are good enough, it will tell you that that harmonic at the 7th fret there sounds like it's sort of in between these two somewhere. Maybe kind of in the middle almost, or close to the middle of the distance between these two notes. And in fact, it is. As I play these three harmonics, we are getting higher in pitch till we wind up at the octave. My question is this: within our musical number system as it exists today, what is the number of the note that we can produce here at the 7th fret harmonic? Can you tell? Listen to it for a second. And what you could do is you could actually count up through the notes in a major scale till you find that note. You know your do, re, mi scale, right? Do, re, mi, fa, so. There it is. It's that note right there. Do, re, mi, fa, so. Within the number system, of course, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, if these two notes are note number 1 and note number 8, then the number of the octave note it's actually note number 5 in our system of pitch, in our musical number system as we understand it today. The three loudest harmonics you can produce are 1, 5, 8. That's the whole history of music right there. Interestingly enough, right up to everything we do today. I'm going to show you something really funny in a moment about this 1, 5, 8 business. But this is the entire history of music right there. You're also going to find out that this relationship with the 5th and the octave are the central pitch relationships in all the music we play today, yet they were the very first ones that we ever discovered. And and the other thing to realize is if you're a thinking creature and you figure out where 1, 5, 8 is, that's about all you need to know in order to figure out where all the other 12 notes are, too. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. In order to see that, we have to go on to a third question down here at the bottom of the page. And it goes like this. Now that humans have discovered their first 3 notes that they can always predict on being there whenever they pick up their bow and arrow, not only have they discovered their first 3 notes, they have also discovered their first 3 distances between notes. And remember, that is the whole hugely important subject of intervals, which we talked a little bit about back at the beginning of the musical number system discussion. So far, the only intervals we've talked about are half steps and whole steps. But another thing to remember is an octave is an interval too, isn't it? An octave is just a large interval. It's the distance from that note right there to that note right there. So once we've discovered our first 3 notes, we've also discovered our first 3 really significant intervals. And so the question goes like this: what intervals have we also uncovered or discovered? If we found our first three notes, we've also found our first three intervals. And what are these intervals? Well, it would be the distance from this note to this note. Remember, it's all about the distances between the notes. That's what intervals are out. We've also discovered the distance between this note and this note. And we've also discovered the distance from this note all the way up to this note. What are these intervals? Well, let's talk about this one from 1 to 8 first. And as we've already mentioned several times, the distance from 1 to 8 is that all-important interval that we call an octave. And in fact, that's where we got the octave from, right there. And it still is the central pitch pattern in just about everything you do today. Now, what do we call the interval between 1 and 5? Well, you're just going to have to trust me on this for right now. We're going to be heavily into the subject of intervals in a few hours from now, but intervals get their names from how they relate to the musical number system, so maybe not surprisingly, the distance between note number 1 and note number 5 is called a fifth. As a matter of fact, it's called a perfect fifth, but we won't bother with what that word perfect means for now. We will later on. Now, 5 is sort of in the middle of the octave, but it's not exactly in the middle of the octave. In other words, it's not the same distance from 1 to 5 that it is from 5 to 8. 5, that's a very important thing to understand. 5 is not the exact mathematical middle of the octave. If it was, our whole system of pitch probably would have stalled right there, and we would have never come up with a 12-note system at all. It actually turns out that 5 is actually a half step high of the middle of the octave, and you'll see in a moment that's kind of where we got the concept of the half step from. Once we figured out where the middle of the octave was and we had this 5 that was a half step above that, that's just one of the factors that led us to understand what a half step was. What do we call the interval between 5 and 8? This is our third interval right here. This one's a little bit harder to see. A lot of people go, is it a third? Because they try to add 5 and 3 to get 8. And it doesn't really work that way. Again, later on you're going to see more in depth how this works. But the way you want to think of it more is it kind of goes like this: 5, 6, 7, 8. So actually the interval between 5 and 8 is actually known as a fourth. The other reason that interval is called a fourth is you'll find out it is the same pitch distance between note number 5 and note number 8 that it is between note number 1 and note number 4. So that's why it's called a fourth. 5 and 8 are the same distance apart that 1 and 4 are. There are your first three notes that humans discovered. These are also the first three big intervals and once you understand these intervals, in a way, I don't think it really happened this way, but humans could have extrapolated all of the other 12 notes just from understanding those three notes right there. For example, if they experimented with these pitch relationships for a while. Now, I don't really care whether you follow exactly what I'm doing right here. It's really not important, but I'll just sort of give you a sense of the fact that if you understand where 1, 5, 8 is, you can figure out the whole 12-note system. My favorite quote is, lock a monkey in a closet for 3 million years and he'll come out playing Bach. You know what I mean? It's all right there can be taken right from these three notes right here. For example, when they're looking at 5 and 8 here, once they started to understand what an interval of a fourth sounds like, it was only a matter of time before they learned to back this relationship up over to here, and that would have showed them where note number 4 was. You know, they just took this interval that they knew between 5 and 8 and moved it over here, and that showed them where note number 4 was. Now they know what 4 and 5 sound like. So that trained their ears to actually understand what a whole step sounds like, because they've got 4 and 5, and then so 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5. They know what a whole step sounds like. Once they knew what a whole step sounded like, that would have allowed them, for example, to fill in note number 2, because that's a whole step above 1, and then they would have figured out where 3 was, because that's a whole step above 2. They could have figured out where note number 6 was, because that's a whole step above 5. And they could have figured out where note number 7 was, because that's a whole step above 6. Now, the final little piece falls into place, because if they know what 3 and 4 sound like, and if they know what 7 and 8 sound like, they now know what a half step sounds like. And they could go back in and fill in all the half steps in between. So that's where you get all your sharp and flat numbers too. Sharp 1, flat 2. And there it is. If you're a thinking creature and you figure out where 158 is, you can use that to extrapolate the entire 12-note system right out of that. Pretty interesting, huh? This is the thing. The record companies don't want you to know this because they want you to go out and buy all the Jimi Hendrix and the Beethoven albums. But the thing is, music is a totally knowable and understandable phenomenon, and it really isn't even all that complicated, is it? Are you having any trouble understanding any of this stuff that I've said? Yeah, maybe a little here and there, a little bit confusing, but for the most part, it's all kind of sort of like common sense, really, in the end. And there's no reason to believe that if you just learn your stuff, that you couldn't be as great a musician as anyone who ever lived. Yes, there is talent, and yes, Jimi Hendrix was talented, and yes, Beethoven was talented, but they may not have been more talented than you are. And if you just know your stuff, then you can do anything you want with music. So, 158. It's the whole history of music right there. Now, I don't really care whether anybody remembers what I just did with the intervals there. I don't care whether you remember that whole caveman thing at all. I think it's interesting to know this stuff, but the really significant thing is there are two topics, two concepts that you want to take away from this discussion. One is this: everything about music is knowable. You know, there are some metaphysical questions that you can ask about music. For example, why do major chords make humans feel happy, and why do minor chords make humans feel sad? I don't know. I don't know why that is. But I do know what constitutes a major chord and what constitutes a minor chord. There's no mystery about the structures of any of these things. We haven't talked about that stuff much yet, but we will be getting into that stuff. So, the first thing you want to take away from this discussion is everything about music is knowable. The second thing you want to take away from this discussion is what are the three most important notes in all of music? And there they are right there. 1, 5, 8. Those are the three most important notes in all of music. And it comes back to us in all different levels when we play music. These relationships, the fifth and the fourth and the octave are like the metaphor that I have is like you're looking at this giant skyscraper, and you're looking at and this is like a metaphor for Western music, and you're looking at this big skyscraper, and on the outside it appears to all be made out of bricks and glass, right? The only thing is, you begin to think, if this thing was really just made out of bricks and glass, it would have fallen over a long time ago, right? So what you do is you grab a jackhammer and you go over to the side of the building and you start chipping away at the bricks, and you bust through the wall, and you look inside the building and you look up and you see that really what is holding the entire building up is all these big iron girders that are all welded and bolted together. So it's really the iron girders that are holding up the whole thing, and the bricks and glass are just stuck on the outside in order to make the things look better. And I lost my train of thought there. When we expose this stuff right here, what we are exposing is the iron girders of music. And so many things come to pass. You've heard of, we mentioned our 1-4-5 progression. It's right there on your slide reel. You don't really have to look at that. You'll notice down here is a 1-4-5 progression. Do you see that 1-4-5 comes directly from 1-5-8? There's your 1-4 relationship. There's your 1-5 relationship. So, you know, an awful lot of the songs we play in the Western world are all 1-4-5 progressions. There's where it came from. Now, one last thing, I'll show you this funny thing. Wouldn't you agree that for probably about the last 40 years or so, wouldn't you agree that this is one of the most popular pitch patterns in all of Western music? It's a chord, isn't it? Do you know what kind of a chord this is? It's that really hard, rocky sounding chord. It's called a power chord. This could be Cream in 1968. Could be Nirvana. All all hard rock kind of feeds off this chord. It's a thing called a 5 chord or a power chord. I imagine you probably know them. Interesting thing is, what number notes are in a power chord? 158. Everybody thinks this is some new thing that we invented a couple of decades ago. Nope. It is the oldest pitch pattern of all. And isn't that interesting? Okay, well, we're out of time for right now. We've just got a couple of a little bit more, again, to wrap up in the next hour. And we're going to be on to other interesting stuff next time. So, this is Scotty West signing off for now. Have fun and keep practicing, and we'll see you next week, okay? Bye-bye.